Welcome to a brief video summary of our presentation, Educating Social Workers Through a Pandemic, Challenges and Sources of Resilience. My name is Jason Maliniot, and I'll be presenting alongside Dr. Stacy Girardi. Dr. Girardi and I are faculty in the School of Social Work at New Mexico State University, and having experienced the impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic on social work education firsthand, we were interested in exploring this further, as you'll see in the study we conducted. Through this study, we sought to capture current experiences of social work educators and hopefully learn some things that we can apply to any disruptive events in the future. To provide a little background on our study, due to the COVID-19 pandemic, many schools experienced a rapid transition to online learning. There are many schools of social work that provide both site-based and online learning platforms, and even here at NMSU, where we have a fully online MSW program option, moving all coursework online was still quite challenging. Some of the emerging research on the impact of COVID-19 on social work education reflects this shared challenge, along with creating a new landscape in terms of supporting faculty, students, and our community stakeholders. We also found it important to consider that students and faculty were all dealing with impacts of the pandemic on their own lives, and that the pandemic is situated contextually during a time of political and social unrest amidst the background of long-standing racial injustice. Lastly, there are challenges specific to social work education to consider, including the monumental impact the pandemic had on field education and the disproportionate impact of the pandemic on certain communities, often those reflected in our social work classrooms. The data collected for the study we are presenting was nested inside a larger survey sent to licensed social work practitioners and social work educators across the United States this past May and June. There were 63 social work educators spanning a variety of locations and universities that responded to our survey. We asked open-ended questions to gather a sense of the challenges they and their students faced, as well as sources of strength and resilience. We undertook an inductive coding analysis based on Creswell's 2012 description of systematic grounded theory. One researcher conducted the initial coding of data that was reviewed against the raw data by a second researcher, with final themes and sub-themes determined collaboratively. For a discussion of the results, I'm going to turn the presentation over to Dr. Girardi.
Our coding of participant responses in the area of challenges that students experienced during the pandemic yielded 4 key themes. The first had to do with disruption to field education. And we see here several of the sub-themes that emerged within that category, kind of describing the different disruptions to field that students experienced. We also observed that there were significant challenges with online learning and instruction reported by participants. And again, several sub-themes emerged that had to do with quality of coursework, student adjustment to online technology accessibility. By far the biggest theme had to do with the adverse impact on student well-being of the pandemic. We saw, significant reports of student psychosocial distress, challenges with increased external responsibilities and pressures, challenges to their own health and safety, uncertainty about their professional future, identity-based adversity, even in the experience of some students of color. And then the last theme we identified had to do with uncertain leadership and institutional decision-making and the way that adversely impacted students. Outside of challenges, though, we also had participants talk about sources of strength and resilience they saw in students. And here we had 3 key themes that emerged with several sub-themes within each. The first had to do with adaptive responses that students demonstrated to adversity. And this had to do with their internal response. When they experienced challenges, how did they respond? We had some really interesting sub-themes around flexibility, use of recovery capital, sense of perspective, and the ability to learn and find meaning from challenges. Supportive skills and practices were also important, and those had to do with skills for online learning and skills for self-care and active coping. And then finally, external sources of support were significant. Students supported one another through mutual aid. They communicated and connected with their faculty and with program. Instructors and programs provided flexibility, which was significant and important. And natural supports, family and community, were significant. One of our key conclusions is that the sources of resilience that our participants identified nicely correspond to the same challenges that they identified. So we see over here different ways in which student internal responses to adversity, the skills and practices that they bring, the supports and relationships they can call upon can help them meet the challenges of changing structures for learning that happened in the pandemic and will continue to happen, the socio-political uncertainty, and then also the adversity they've experienced directly as a result of the pandemic. We also saw that a lot of the participants were speaking in different ways to the usefulness of mindfulness in some way, with kind of an emphasis on understanding adversity and acceptance. And being able to move through challenges with this acceptance, and also a focus on kind of learning and growth out of it. This leads us to talk a little bit, think a little bit about the value of trauma-informed education as a framework for supporting students through the pandemic and other similar challenges, in particular the ways that these frameworks for education can support and emphasize the value of relationship, and also the value of helping students to learn and maintain practices for regulation that can help them respond in effective ways to these challenges. And finally, we noticed that despite the unique challenges to social work, particularly in the area of field education, there are also some really unique opportunities for learning and growth in our field, specifically because of the pandemic, and that there are significant opportunities for us to capitalize on that and use those to promote student resilience.
It was interesting to learn how social work educators experienced the COVID-19 pandemic and their perspective of the impact on students. We saw evidence of a parallel process as both educators and students navigated these challenges. This parallel process can be utilized in developing and strengthening adaptive responses to the pandemic-related challenges and possibly to future disruptive events. We also found that many challenges stem from communication barriers, which is understandable given the new landscape of social work education in a COVID positive world. We recommend that social work instructors intentionally build connections with students and other external sources of support, modeling the strategy for students. As well, explicit instruction on utilizing skill sets would be beneficial. Lastly, any conversation around the COVID-19 pandemic should look at how the pandemic fits within the broader context of social work education. There are many learning opportunities for students as they become the next generation of social work practitioners. Let's help students become leaders around adapting to changing circumstances, coping with adversity, and remaining effective social workers able to view the pandemic from multiple lenses within a social justice perspective.